Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kayhan Parsi, ASBH President, and welcome to the very first of ASBH's new webinar series, Building Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, DEI into Bioethics and Health Humanities Scholarship and Practice. This free series supports ASBH's strategic priorities and is a product of the Society's DEI framework. I want to thank the DEI Committee of ASBH, comprised of Sabrina Darrington, Jennifer Blumenthal-Barbie, Katie Wasson, and Patrick Smith for their work in developing this DEI webinar series. For this first webinar, I am absolutely delighted that ASBH member and former board member, Dr. Nneka Sederstrom, will be presenting. So just a little bit of background of Dr. Sederstrom. Nneka Sederstrom, PhD, MPH, MA, FCCP, FCCM, is the Chief Health Equity Officer of the Hennepin Healthcare System. Dr. Sederstrom received her BA in philosophy from George Washington University in 2001. That same year, she began her career at the Center for Ethics at MedStar Washington Hospital Center in Washington, D.C. She completed her master's in philosophy and public policy from Howard University in 2003. She then completed her PhD at Howard in sociology with concentrations in medical sociology and race, class, and gender inequality, and then later earned an MPH in global health management from George Washington. She served for several years as director of the Center for Ethics and director of the Spiritual Care Department at MedStar. In 2016, she joined Children's Minnesota, where she served as the director of the Clinical Ethics Department for almost 5 years. She's recently joined the executive leadership team at Hennepin Healthcare System as the new Chief Health Equity Officer, and Dr. Sederstrom just told me that she was made for this job, which is absolutely wonderful. So in this role, she leads efforts in addressing health disparities, equity, and anti-racism in the institution and community. She's a member of several professional societies, holds a leadership position in chest medicine and the Society of Critical Care Medicine. She's a fellow of the American College of Chest Physicians and a fellow of the American College of Critical Care Medicine. She's widely published in equity and clinical ethics and speaks regularly at national and international meetings. In addition, she is the mother of 2 amazing children and married to an amazing husband. She loves to read, especially long epic fantasy series, dance, knit, bake, and engage in all things crafty. Her favorite music is anything before 2005, and her favorite quote is by Maya Angelou. Quote, "Do the best you can until you know better, then when you know better, do better." So the title of Dr. Sederstrom's presentation today is Our Past, Our Present, Our Future. Please welcome Dr. Sederstrom.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and thank you, Kayhan, for the ability to speak to everybody today. I am delighted to be the first of this series and really excited that ASBH is taking the time to have these conversations. So with that, we'll get started because I've got a lot of slides to get through, and I want to make sure we have some time excuse me, for Q&A. So before we begin this conversation, I want to make sure that we take a moment to set the tone and the expectations. I spent most of my career, probably 20 years of my career in clinical ethics. And in it, I've tried to ensure that I hold spaces for families, I hold spaces for the providers, for the other team members, students, the trainees, other ethicists, making sure that we have a chance to hear everyone's story, making sure that they have a chance to tell us what their concerns are, and to take that into consideration before we made any adjustments and any recommendations. So holding space is really necessary for the work that we do, especially in clinical ethics, but it's also extremely necessary for this work. It is a deliberate act. We have to show the value of it. We have to recognize the importance of it. So what I want for you in this talk is to make sure that you realize that this is an opportunity to hold space for some truths that you may not have ever known before. It's the space to hold truths or hold space for voices that you may never heard before. Conversations that have probably been peripherally around you, but never actually with you. What we want to do in this space is to attempt to silence the voices and the feelings that make us uncomfortable because we want to sit in that discomfort. We want to hold on to the feeling, to give ourselves time to reflect on what it is that's causing us to have that emotion. Why are we feeling those things and having those experiences? So we need to hold space for our discomfort and silence all the things around you that make you feel like it is easy to get out of that space, because that's a better place to be. Not for this conversation. This conversation, we need to sit in the emotions and the discomfort, because that's the only way to the other side. So I'm asking you to hold space for yourself and to reflect and to sit and go on this journey with me. We're going to talk about our past, we're going to talk about our present, and then we're going to see how we can be better in the future. This is a picture that I took standing on the shores of Jamaica when I was there with my good friends last summer. All three of us were there for three different reasons related to what was going on with us personally, but we knew that we needed to have a little bit of time to just kind of separate from it all and be in a beautiful place to lay all the burdens down just for a little bit. And that's what this image was. It's standing on the beach in Montego Bay, Jamaica. But as I reflected on this, I also was listening to the podcast 1619. And in it, the author starts off with a very powerful statement. I'm going to read it to you. She states that no one knew when the realization set in that there would be no more opportunities to hug a grandparent, dance with a cousin at a celebration, or kiss a child. Did it take 1 week or 2 or 3 on the open waters of the Atlantic to irrevocably break the ties of a people, their culture, their safety, their security of home? Some decided that this break was not acceptable and chose to jump overboard to take one final swim with their ancestors. Others chose to die from hunger strikes, deciding that death was a more favorable outcome than to take their chances on what lies at the end of these waters. This view of the Atlantic Ocean, standing on the shores of the Caribbean island of Jamaica that I told you about, that many of you have enjoyed, as myself, as I've enjoyed. This is the view that many captured Africans saw when they arrived at their destination. But unlike us who see this view with beauty and safety and security and peace, this was not the feeling that greeted the people who saw this at the birth of our nation. So we know the story. Africans, some stolen, some captured and sold, some freely given based off of lies told of a better opportunity and a better place, were encapsulated in the hulls of slave ships and brought to the colonies that became the Americas to be sold in what we now term chattel slavery. The first of these ships was called the White Lion. In it, about 20 or 30 Africans enslaved in this pirate ship landed on the shores of Point Comfort around Virginia. These pirates wanted to trade for goods and services, and the only thing they had were these people to offer as trade. So they traded the 20 or 30 Africans to the colonists in Point Comfort. And this was the first recorded time on the shores of what became the Americas, the United States of America. In 1619, it was the birth of slavery. Now, it's really important to pay attention to this, because what we've not really done a lot of in learning our history is understand the true impact of the slave trade. So it's estimated that between 1500 and 1866, Europeans transported about 12.5 million enslaved Africans to the Americans. And of course, in the Americas, that included Central America, South America, where the majority of these slaves went to. But only about 5% of those came to the United States of America. We do know that about 1.8 to almost 2 million people died during the Middle Passage. And that transatlantic voyage that we know of, that many chose to jump overboard and to do other things instead of to live on what was on the other side. In North America, though, in the space that we call the United States of America, about 5% of the total captured Africans made it to our shores. And that was the beginning of our work in the slave trade. And we kept the slave trade going until the 1860s, about 1866. But the reality is that by the time we got to 1866, the majority of people who were Black in the United States that were slaves were born in the country over many, many generations. We did not bring in too many slaves through the trade. As the years went through, the United States chose mechanisms to develop their own workforce through forced breeding and other interactions that caused the birth of the people known as Black people in America. That was the way we chose to handle slavery. So we had the majority of the people living by the 1860s were now born from many generations of slavery, and were born into this without needing to use what was seen as too expensive of a measure to bring people across the Atlantic to the United States. So the people who were here were made Black by people who decided that they were white. And in this new place, Black meant slave. Those who were strong enough to make it through the Middle Passage, who forged the new sense of personhood, who survived into these generations of being born as slaves, had to come up with a new understanding of what it meant to be Black. One that included the understanding that their bodies, their minds, their spirits were no longer their own. They belonged to others who decided that something about their skin color gave them the right to claim ownership over them because of their skin color. So a new link had to be forged for the sake of survival. And that link was with each other. And that was welded together by the shared trauma of enslavement. They were now a new people. They were now each other's people. They now had to create a new identity. And again, we remember that these are people who came from different cultures, different backgrounds, spoke different languages. So over the course of these generations, they had to create what it meant to be human again, that craving for human connection, for family, for community. All of that had to be built into this new world. And it was built based on the shared trauma of slavery. So for hundreds of years, Black people lived under the continual power of dehumanizing. They were beaten, treated like animals, tortured and enslaved. Their families were broken apart, torn apart. Their bodies were mutilated. Their humanity was not only denied, but it was also stolen. There was no reprieve. There was no safe haven, no place to go. Just this continuous understanding that if you were born in this country and you were Black, and you were not considered a human, and your life would be full of continuous trauma. It's impossible to truly understand the impact of what over 200 plus years of chattel slavery did to Black people in the founding of this country. And you think about it, I was listening to a wonderful podcast that if many of you have not listened to it, I urge you to. It's called Seeing White, and it's done by John Biewen out of Duke University. And it's an incredible podcast, but in it, he talks about balancing of the scales and this fascination that happens mostly nowadays in sort of modern America over the idea of violence in Black communities and danger of Black people, and this continuous belief that Black men in particular are highly dangerous individuals, and how those biases work and translate and have led to the violence and abuse that we see in the policing of Black bodies. But he talks about the reality of the violence and the balancing of the scales. So we know that life expectancy was shorter due to violence and unsafe living conditions. We also know that more than half of Black babies born to slaves during that time died. And we know that there was a lack of medical support or any kind of support for slaves if they got sick or injured, oftentimes injured due to violence towards them. So the list is long and it's really immeasurable. It's really hard to measure the to measure the pain and the suffering that was as a result of the violence that was done on Black people during just the years of chattel slavery. If we think further, we know history as it moved through the Civil War and emancipation, and finally through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the 5 decades of terror that make up the civil rights movement, the Great Nadir, all of these elements that if you if you don't know any of these terms, please look them up. All of these important elements within Black history, we know that the violence never went away. So as John Buewen was talking with Shenderai Komunika, who's a professor at Rutgers, about this, he in his mind came up with this scale that one day I hope somebody is artistic enough to draw it, because it's a very important reference that we need to think through when trying to have conversations about racial healing and racialized trauma in the United States. He said, if you look at how we present Black people as violent and dangerous today, and we talk a lot about things like Black on Black crime in Black communities, one thing that we've always not really done a good job of discussing is white on Black crime. And if you look at our history as a country, the scales don't balance out. If you think about how much violence and death has been the result of white on Black crime from the beginning and the founding of our country till now, there's no balancing of the scales. So we don't take the time to really understand how that violence impacts, how that violence continues to impact. And I think that we as a society need to have a better reckoning when it comes to this, because it is important to understand, because as medicine has developed, we've created some really clear facts that have shown the connection between violence and trauma and impacts on DNA. So this first study that I highlight here, Dr. Drury discusses how childhood trauma specifically impacts the DNA. It alters it. It causes immeasurable effects on future life, the opportunity for mental health issues, the opportunity for physical health issues, and that's just traumatic effects on children. The second study is a study on the effects of violence on health overall. And if you look at what this study shows, it says that violence causes biological effects on the body, specifically impacting the brain, the neuroendocrine system, and the immune response, resulting in increased depression, anxiety, PTS, suicide, cardiovascular disease, and premature mortality. So I want us to kind of sit with this for a hot second. We just got through talking a little bit about our country, how it was founded in a very violent manner when it comes to Black people, not even discussing the impact on the indigenous populations that were here prior to this. We're only going to focus specifically on the Black experience in this talk, but that is another element of violence that needs to be addressed. We know that the violence and the trauma doesn't go away. We know that it impacts the health and well-being of people generations later. We also know that our country never got to a point where, although slavery had ended, that somehow meant that things were better. We've never had that yet. So the additional seasons of development that we've gone through have all included ongoing trauma and violence perpetuated on Black bodies. These facts just are. It's not something that makes us feel good or proud. It's not something that we can just ignore. These are facts that we have to face, because the reality is violence causes biological effects on the body. Trauma causes biological effects on the body. Today, Black people walking around are the children of those who have been continuously exposed to racial trauma and racial violence. This is where our work lies and how we address moving forward. This is the facts that we have to face. Because when you look at inequalities and you look at all the other things that we will talk about a little bit more, this is the foundation that needs to be really clear as we move through how do we come to the other side. So let's talk about how this all relates to medicine. Since we're all in the world of medicine, I think it's really important to see how this general overview of how our country was founded and the environment in which the forming of Black people in America was created, and how does this translate to our fields of medicine. First, I think we need to discuss trust. Starting off with a very clear definition of trust, I think is really important because it's not only the basis for the physician-patient relationship, it's also the basis for the clinical ethicist and the patient and the team and the family relationship. Trust must be there. This definition is very clear. Firm belief in the reliability, truth, ability, or strength of someone or something. We have to keep this definition in the forefront of our mind as we go through the relationship of Black people to the medical establishment in America, and how bioethicists, clinical ethicists in particular, address and deal with Black people in the health system. Because we need to know why trust is important and how to develop and build trust. There must be a creation of a firm belief in the reliability, truth, ability, or strength of someone or something. I don't think we've ever done that. And that I think is really important for us to address. So once Black people were notified of their freedom, which was the famous Juneteenth declaration after 2 years post the emancipation, which now I hopefully your institutions will celebrate, just like mine, was this the final ending of the slavery injustices of this country. Black people were then just kind of completely and wholly cut loose without anything to help with the transition of being considered property into now allowing them to fend for themselves. There were no homes made available for people who got kicked off of plantations. They were not given any access to property to even build a home or start their own farming community or anything like that. Food was not made available. There were no safe spaces for them to stay. So what inevitably happened is people gathered in abandoned structures and buildings, specifically thrown throughout the South. Some made it north, most stayed in the South though. These close living quarters had very little hygiene, very little opportunities for hygiene. And so that led to, as we all know, doing any public health research, to public health crisis of diseases like smallpox. There was a huge smallpox outbreak that happened right after, caused a significant public health concern. It increased the mortality rates of the newly freed Black people. And it was actually because smallpox started making its way into white communities and white neighborhoods that there was an outcry for the government to do something about the problem with the freed slaves and the disease that was running through these close living quarters. Now, think to the past 2 years in dealing with the COVID crisis and how we know that COVID impacted Black and brown communities the most. When we think about some of the reasons why that happened, and the close living conditions is one of the #1 issues. So there's a lot of parallels in our history and in our present. So there was the rise of the Freedmen's Bureau, and the Freedmen's Bureau of Medical Division was the first federally funded medical intervention to address the problem of what to do with the health and wellness of the freed Black people. And it was the first example of a federally funded medical program for the underserved, but it was set up to fail. They did not have enough physicians. There was only about 100 doctors that were deployed to cover the tens of thousands of freed persons. They didn't have any hospitals that were available. The hospitals for newly emancipated free persons were few and far in between. They were under resources. They had no beds, no sheets, no linens, medicine or quarantine opportunities. And again, smallpox was running rampant. So the Freedmen's Bureau didn't really do what it was set up to do because it was not provided with the right resources to make it happen. And so again, as a result, mortality rates for Black people were significantly high. But instead of addressing the issue with increasing resource allocation, there was a creation of a new theory that emerged out of the federal government. There were a couple of senators that specifically from the South that hailed this new theory as the way to explain what was going on. And this theory of extinction called for this belief that there's a biological difference in the bodies of Black people. And that difference is leading them to the inability to fight off disease, and allowing them to be free was actually causing them to live in a terminal condition. So freedom was being seen as a terminal condition. There was no reason given to invest in improving hospitals. That was actually seen as wasteful and foolish. Government officials believed this theory of extinction and started to defund the freedmen's hospitals. It was all the way up to the highest levels of our country. President Andrew Johnson was vehemently opposed and vetoed the bill to support the Bureau twice. And if you see this ad, this was one of the ads that was put out when people were fighting to try and actually have some funding for the Freedmen's Bureau. And it basically says, it may be a little hard to read, but it basically says that if you want to support the Negro and cause all this added extra expense for people who should not be supported, then you shouldn't vote with the president. But if you want to be with the white people and help the white people not bear the burden of Black people, then that's when you need to be a president. If you like Congress, then you're supporting the Negro. If you like the president, then you're supporting whiteness and the way the world should be. So needless to say, the beginning of the eugenics movement to create this biological difference in Black bodies, this belief that slavery was not a bad thing and it was actually a better environment for Black people, and that freedom was a terminal condition. That didn't just stop during this time. I think if you think back through the Trump era, there were a lot of commentary from many on Fox News and such that pulled a lot of this rhetoric back out and made statements of things like slavery wasn't all that bad, that Black people had food and shelter and good living conditions, and that this traumatic experience wasn't all slave owners, and that actually it was as a result of the end of slavery that led to these terrible conditions, and why Black people now are seen as lazy or only looking for government handouts or violent and all the other rhetoric. All of that has continued to perpetuate in our society and in our language till this day. But what the message that was really important that was sent to Black people as a result of this Freedmen's Bureaus being canceled and defunded was that Blacks were pretty much told that they needed to care for themselves. They were told by the government and every institution around them that the only way to really be cared for is if you figure it out on your own, because the system that made up America was designed for white people. And if you were not white, then you didn't get access to those systems. So it was clear that you had to figure it out on your own. And figuring out was pretty difficult because you didn't have funding for hospitals. You were denied health care. So you were denied admission to white hospitals if you were sick. If there were a few white hospitals that allowed you to come into those hospitals, they only set up areas like in the basement or in closets and places like that, where they were dirty and dark, and you weren't allowed to be taken care of by white nurses. And at the time, all the nurses and physicians were white. So that became an issue. If you could have a bed in a basement, but then nobody actually cared for you. Black men especially were not allowed to be near white women and white nurses. It was illegal for that. And Black people could only be treated at Black facilities, and there were very, very few. For those of you who know, the one hospital that made it through the Freedmen Bureaus to funding was Howard University Hospital, and that's still standing today as a beacon of the one place that was a Black facility set up for Black people that survived. So white physicians, there are a few white physicians though that tried to engage in helping address the needs for Black patients were very few. It was a very rare thing to see. The medical field very much established itself as a white-only field. They were not able to do anything outside of that. So we think about that in the context of trust. Again, we haven't yet seen in our walk through medical history where the opportunity for building trust between the medical system and Black people were post being allowed to finally seek care post-slavery. So let's think a little bit more about where we are in this trust model. So again, as a refresher, it requires firm belief in the reliability, truth, ability, or strength in others. And as we've seen, hospitals that were for Black people were under-resourced and neglected. So there was no ability to create trust in that system. Government officials, including the President of the United States, were making arguments that enslavement was a better condition than freedom. Again, no opportunity for trust there. There weren't enough physicians or resources to properly care for the newly freed Blacks. So even in the people who were training to care and help for folks that needed help, there was no ability to create trust in those relationships. And there were people who were strong enough to fight for the rights of Black people, but they were so few that it didn't even get seen. So there was no ability to even try and put your trust in that one person because it was so small. Those messages never got to the masses. What did start getting to the masses, though, was this beginning of this conversation around Black people taking care of their own. So Rebecca Lee Crumford was the first Black woman to graduate from the New England Female Medical School and started this whole movement of educating Black women in particular to take care of themselves and their families. And it was done in this book that she wrote and published called A Book on Medical Discourses in 2 parts. This was the first time that Black people started to believe that they could have good health, but the only way to get that good healthcare is to do it themselves and to trust their own. So Black clinicians since Dr. Crumpler have taken up this mantle and have been the strongest advocates for the health and well-being of the Black community ever since. And we know the data today shows clearly that clinician racial concordance is the highest impact on patient outcome in decreasing health disparity than anything else. This was where that began. That conversation, which we'll talk about a little bit more, causes a lot of discomfort because what the message is saying is that Black doctors are the only people able to take care of Black people. That's what people hear, but that's not the truth. The truth is that because of this beginning, and because of the ease in which it is to develop the most important thing that we've been talking about since we mentioned the relationship to medicine, which is trust, that trusting relationship happens immediately when Black patients see Black clinicians. That the power of that trust causes the Black patient to be able to do things that they aren't able to do with white clinicians, like believe what the physician says about preventative strategies and screening and taking medications on time and all the things that lead to improved outcomes. So that's why the clinician racial concordance is an important conversation, not saying that white doctors can't take care of Black people. That's not what that means. But what we have to figure out a way to do is developing that trust in a manner that makes it feel as safe as this relationship. And this relationship has been embedded in the Black community since the early 1900s. So this is a very important relationship to remember. While people like Dr. Crumpler were working through trying to help Black people take care of themselves, the big societies like the American Medical Association, at the time an all-white entity for only physicians who were white, spent lots of time and money trying to advocate against that. They tried to maintain this separate but not equal strategy that grew through the segregation laws and the push of those kinds of big lobbyists against the budding new Black physicians who were starting to be developed and were asking for opportunities to become members of the AMA. The fight against that also helped to perpetuate, again, this belief that the medical system was set up for white people. Black people had to figure out their own. And they had to come up with their own healthcare facilities, and they had to come up with their own doctors, and they had to come up with their own way to create an opportunity to move forward. The AMA did a lot of help in working to destroy the first attempts at the universal healthcare, which was proposed by President Truman at the time. In addition to not allowing Black physicians into their membership, they worked long and hard on creating the huge racial divide between the medical system and the Black community. They've since apologized for this history, but this is their foundation. And this is the kind of thing that we have to look at, be uncomfortable with, and work to the other side of it. So what finally gained some traction actually was the creation of Medicare. It was widely supported by Black physicians because they saw it as the only way, and their white allies, and they saw it as the only way to get Black people into the white healthcare system. Because at the time that Medicare came out, it wasn't a focusing on color, it was a focusing on age. So the requirement was for elderly people in general to have improved access to hospital systems and to be taken care of. So elderly people allowed for Black people. This became the financial carrot and stick that helped to make hospitals become more compliant with the newly minted desegregation laws of the Civil Rights Movement of 1964. If you had elderly people in your hospital, you got money. If you only chose elderly white people, you were losing money because you didn't get paid for caring for elderly Black people, and that doubled your opportunity to get money. So when the bill finally producing the opportunity for this initiative of Medicare went through, it caused a huge desegregation that happened. 3,000 hospitals desegregated within 4 months of Medicare in order to have the opportunity to make money through this new service. So I want us to sit and think about this for a second. 3,000 hospitals decided to desegregate within 4 months because the government offered them money to care for Black people. It was not because there was a cultural shift of wanting to give Black people the care they believe they deserved, or give them access to care that was as good or as equal to whites. It was specifically because they now got paid to care for Black people. So even 1965, when this happened, there was no feeling in the medical system of caring for people of color as equals to white people. We fast forward to our inequities today, and this is still extremely prevalent. I know many of you have probably read this book by Dr. Harriet Washington, but I want to put a plug into it right now. This is my academic side. If you haven't, please take a screenshot and read her book. There are just way too many examples of atrocities to Black bodies throughout the birthing and continuation of the country of the United States of America. And her book does a great job of outlining all these atrocities. And again, if we're thinking about the measurement of trust, there was never an opportunity through all this history to develop a trusting relationship with a system that was founded for white people, maintained only for white people, and only allowed Black people in when they were able to get money for it, and didn't do anything to try and build the relationship that was based off of mutual respect or understanding. So Dr. Harriet Washington, incredible book. Please make sure you get a copy of it to understand a little bit more. In addition, I will also put a plug in for another amazing book by Heather McGhee, The Sum of Us, What Racism Cost Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Her book does a phenomenal job of not only looking at the social impacts, but also the economic impacts that racism has, that this belief that it's a zero-sum game is founded on the biggest lie that has ever been told. There is no requirement for white people to lose in order for Black and brown people to gain. And she does an incredible job of talking through how much it actually costs us as a country, as a people, and as a society when we continue to perpetuate these systems of racism in all of our structures. And she does talk a lot about our medical structure as well. But another amazing read that I think is a very good foundation of how do we get to where we are today and then what we do next. So our present, this is really important because you've heard the phrase that we're living in this twin pandemic before. Maybe some of you have. I've heard it a lot, so I'm going to say that. I've heard it. It's really important because we're still living in this twin pandemic, the pandemic of COVID-19 and the pandemic of 1619. And this phrase is being used to try to light of the parallels that we talked about a little earlier of living through the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has impacted the daily lives of Black and brown people today. The ever-present structural racism that exists as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic is on display a little more than it used to be, specifically because of the highlights that COVID-19 has had on our society. So we need to explore this a little bit more, because our history defines our current present, and we need to address the realities of our present before we can figure out our future. A new study was published in JAMA that showed that even though we've made some improvements in racial disparities in healthcare over the last 2 decades, the reality is that these improvements have been minimal. And in some cases, the gaps have actually even widened. So how can this be the case when one argues that we've addressed racism in a very different way than what it used to be, right? Some say that we've gone from the overt racism to the covert racism, and that racism, of course, is still there. Which we all know, but we've seemingly grown a little in the last 20 years to make it not feel as intense as the racism of the 60s, 1960s and below. But we have to take a second to look at how in medicine, we haven't done a good job of yet embracing what it means to be an anti-racist. And so as a result, our country, although maybe has made some really good notable health improvements, there have not been dedicated intentional improvements that have actually deepened and widened the disparities. I just was at a conference in DC over the last week, and there was a presenter who was one of the original authors of the book Unequal Treatment. And he talked about how in 20 years where we are now after unequal treatment, and the fascination between when Unequal Treatment came out as an IOM report and To Err is Human. It came out within months of each other. But think for a second how our hospital systems responded to unequal treatment versus how they responded to the book To Err is Human. I don't know of any hospital that took on the mantle of addressing unequal treatment and disparities at the same intensity that they did to address patient safety and outcomes related to quality and quality assurance. And the one thing that is the striking reason for why that doesn't feel like it happened is because unequal treatment talked about how we were treating Black people unequally, but To Err is Human talked about how everyone, white people included, can die from hospital errors. So the white system of our hospital system, our healthcare system, took up the charge to ensure that white people could be safe, and some Black people too. It didn't take up the charge on how to address health disparities and unequal treatment. So now, 20 years later, nothing really has changed. And so he talked a lot about what that is, and are we at a time now where we can pull that back out and try again? This report had a lot of data on outcomes by race and by hospitals and regions. The report did an excellent job. I urge you to look it up if you want to look it up. But again, this feels like it's, a broken record. Anybody can find out the health disparities within their own systems anywhere, right? Every region and location has the data. So you don't have to look at this one as a generic around health disparities within the country. You can just look at the one that's related to your hospital in your area, because they exist. But if you look at some of the stuff that came out of this, these were what I felt were probably the most notable examples about how far we've not come in this space. And I think I just want to really highlight this one statement that says health disparities persist by gender, geography, race, and ethnicity, and other factors driven by systemic inequalities in social, economic, and environmental conditions people face. So that is just where we are. This is stating the truth, that these conditions are all factored because of the systemic inequalities. If you break down systemic inequalities, and this is also another fascinating thing to do when you read these reports, there's a lot of words that people use as euphemisms for race, that they don't actually say race and racism because of the worry of using that word as a charged word. But racism is the foundation for all of these things. It is implied in every one of these areas, and it's in the lack of addressing these specific outcomes is an exacerbation due to racism, because we're having a really hard time naming what is truly the problem. And the problem is racism. So we need to all practice naming this, and not just the data, but really what the foundation is for why the data exists. So when we focus on the top illnesses that cause the greatest morbidity and mortalities of all people, African Americans or Black people are more likely to die at an early stage from all causes, right? This was prior to COVID. And now, as we know from COVID, our life expectancy for Black people have dropped by another 2 years. So we have to really start truly asking ourselves, what is the case? Why is this the case? If you look at these areas, it's high blood pressure, diabetes, and stroke, right? 2 out of the 3 are cardiovascular illnesses. Now, if you think back to the slide that was a little bit ago on violence and trauma and what that does to the body that is imprinted in our DNA, cardiovascular disease, neuroendocrine disease, all of these elements are specifically affected by trauma and violence, and it's imprinted on the DNA. So when people ask and they say, oh, there's another study that came out that showed Black people die more from X, Y, and disease, and they look at it as if it's a new problem. I oftentimes find myself getting really frustrated, because what I really want to say is this really new? Like, are you truly shocked at this data? Because it's inevitable. You pull up any new journal, there's going to be an article that says Black people, Indigenous people suffer greatly from X, Y, and Z, or get worse care for X, Y, and Z. And we keep adding to the data pool without actually addressing the foundation and the why. And I think we have to be a little bit more mindful in these day and age of when we see another study, we should need to ask, or we hear somebody wanting to do another study, we need to ask, why do they need more data? At what point do we feel like we've got enough data that we can actually do something about it and go back and figure out the cause, the root cause, and create changes to help us get better? COVID, we all know this one. 1.4 times the rate of Black people have died, rate of white people, Black people have died. It's not a shock. Again, there'll be a lot of more data coming out about the impact of COVID on Black and brown people, but I don't really know the reason for why we need to have more things validating things that we should have already known. But then there's times when the full display of what it means to bear the burden of Blackness is on in front for everyone to see. And I think that COVID helped to not only shed light on it, but shed light on it now during a time when people are a little more in tune to wanting to pay attention to it. And the tragic death of Dr. Susan Moore was one of those spaces in which people had a hard time ignoring her story and what was happening to her. It was because she was Black. I've seen a lot of studies, articles written post then and comments from the institution that she worked at, right? Being Black was the one thing that caused her issues. She was socioeconomically not disadvantaged. She was high education, very literate. She was a physician in the hospital that she was being treated for. So all the elements that usually people say is Black education and all that wasn't her case. Her case was she was Black and was denied care that she saw was beneficial as a result of being Black. And there are many articles. You Google her name, you will see many articles of people arguing that her institution said that they didn't deny her care. It wasn't because she was Black. But I'm going to tell you something that is hard for some white people in particular to hear, but I really want you to just think about it for a second, internalize it, and I'm really happy to have further conversation with you on it. The reality is when a person, a Black person or a brown person specifically says that the thing that's happening to me is due to my race, I'm being mistreated because of my race, I'm being discriminated against because of my race, whatever the answer is, if they say that it's because of their race, I need you to just believe them. Do not look for ways to judge or justify or figure out or validate that it is, because it takes a lot for a Black person or a brown person to actually form those words. There is a whole host of things that we daily live through, little bitty microaggressions, and as they call it, death by 1,000 cuts. There is constant racialized trauma in various forms that go through us every day. We don't call them all out. If we have to call it out, then we've reached the end of our ability to manage the day-to-day assaults. So you have to just believe, because it is impossible for white people to understand the feeling of what it means to have something happening to you because of your race. So therefore, it's impossible for it to be judged. So I urge you, if there's only one thing that you learn from this talk today and you take back with you if you're white, I urge you, when somebody of color says this thing is happening to them because of their color, just believe it and do something different than question or try to judge. If somebody had done something different, Dr. Moore would probably still be alive. So the bottom line is that we're currently living in a culture of inequity, right? The truth is racism is the foundation of our clinical practice here in the United States, and we have yet to do anything to reconcile that. We truly have yet to even acknowledge it. They're starting to have work on acknowledging it, but it's still small. We need to work on changing this norm of white bodies being normalized while Black and brown bodies are seen as other. We need to not just look at the gaps and disparities in outcomes, but actively work to ameliorate them. And we can only improve once we ourselves take the time to understand these truths and move forward. Increasing the number of Black providers, addressing personal bias is mandatory. We have to do a lot of work on this culture of inequity in order for us to move forward. And I think we can. I think that there is a brighter future ahead. I know that it seems like this has been really dark. We've talked about a lot of sad things, a lot of hard things, but I have faith that we're at the pinnacle of another important movement in our country, and there is time for things to stick and take us to a new level. And I think that that's where we are. But I don't think we're going to get there if we don't start with what I believe is the most important element, and that is empathy. It has to start with empathy. Empathy is defined as the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another, of either the past, the present, without having the feelings, thoughts, or experiences fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. Let's break that down. It's an understanding, an awareness, a sensitivity, and a vicariously experiencing feelings, thoughts, and experiences. This is a lot, but I think that what we need to do is take this as an all-encompassing sort of 360 approach. We really have to do more than just understand what's happening to someone, or be aware, or be sensitive to, or vicariously live through that experience. We really have to do all of it, because that is the way to build empathy towards others. And empathy is extremely important, because research is now showing that empathy is the way to increase patient reporting of symptoms and concerns. It's the way to improve the patient participation in care, and it enhances the patient compliance and satisfaction. And we talked a little bit back about this concept of Black people feeling safe and comfortable and trusting of Black clinicians. And we want that to be a reality, because that is the fastest way to get through the outcomes, to improve the outcomes. But while we're doing that, this is the and. The and is we need to train our white clinicians on how to be empathetic, because empathy and practicing empathy is really important. We have to own who we are in order to move forward. As a bioethicist, our duty is to understand where society has impacted those we serve. It's our duty to understand where our own physical presence impacts those that we're serving. We can't do this effectively. We don't understand where we are. We don't understand the field that we're playing, and we don't understand what it means to be a practitioner. We don't understand the academics behind it, what the system is set up. And that's part of developing empathy. When we develop empathy, then we see this for what it is. We're living currently in these very tips of the iceberg of racism, and we're not really addressing the significant amount of the foundations of racism that our society is built off. That's the big part of the iceberg. We cannot move forward with our professionalism in this space until we recognize that we must undo the work that has been done. This iceberg is where the work lies. If you look closely, more in the center part, you can see healthcare access to and disparities are closer to the bottom, which is the fattest part of the iceberg, right? That's the real deep depths that we have to do. We have to get down to that level in order to build up. We tend to every day equate the things like addressing microaggressions or racial insensitivities or some of the overt racist acts like happened in Charlottesville. We make that the work and we think that's the work, but that's not really the work. Those are a culture of, overt racism and white supremacy that is detracting from the real work. It makes us feel like that's where we need to go because these overt acts are in our face while the systemic covert acts, the institutionalized acts are maintaining our structure. That's where doing the real work is. If we think of ethics, and we think of what it means to be clinical ethicists and bioethicists, we have to face this reality. Bioethics itself needs to be decolonized. The real work is first looking at who do we read? Who do we study? Who's doing the work? Where does our profession lie? Who are our leaders? Who are our trainers? How is the academy preparing you for these conversations at the bedside or in teaching others in order to have this? Who is speaking for our patients and on our patients' behalf? What are our patients trying to tell us about our own interactions? Are they engaging with us? Are they not? How are we uplifting our voices, the voices of color within our patient population, within our provider population? We can, as a profession, continue to ignore that we have not done what it takes to improve our own house and then think we can go out and help others. We can't. We can't tell others what is the better way to be or what is the right decision when we haven't even taken into consideration how our own physical presence has impacted that decision. There were many times early in my career where I didn't even realize how powerful it was that I walked in as a Black bioethicist to talk to a Black family that was dealing with a crisis. That comfort when I walked through the door was palpable. I later would hear when clinicians would ask for ethics support, they would specifically ask for me. And I knew that that was a trigger, right? Like that was we need Nneka because this is a Black family and everybody else is white. So this Black family is not listening to us anymore. So maybe Nneka can go fix it. Now in my seasoned professional age, I would have challenged back if someone asked specifically for me, because I would have said to them, why can't you do it? I would have made them name it because the pretending that it wasn't the reason, not helping the conversation. I would have definitely still gone because I know the impact of what my presence has on these patients and their families to help them through probably the worst day of their life. So I would have gone, but I don't want my white counterparts to feel like they somehow don't have to engage in the reality of what they were trying to say. Our profession has not said what it needs to say. We don't have enough by far Black people in bioethics in general. And it's not because they don't exist or don't want to learn or don't have an impact on how our medical societies, our medical worlds are built. It's not the case. We in bioethics have not done our work to decolonize and make this a priority. So our profession can't ignore it. We just can't any longer. We know that we impact our patients. And if you take a second now and think, if you're a white or non-Black or brown clinician, and you think about walking into the room of a Black family, knowing that your presence in of itself causes more barrier and more hurt than good, have you done anything to acknowledge that with that patient in order to decrease it? Have you figured out a way to increase the empathy so that they learn to trust you? Or did you not even realize that that was something that you should be paying attention to? That's where we've failed our clinicians in our trainings for our clinical ethicists. We failed to teach them that you bring you into the room. And what does that mean in our society based off of who we are, where we came from, and where we're trying to go? I know that there's a lot of work now that is starting on how to have these conversations, but it can't just be done in a silo. It has to be open, it has to be transparent, it has to be uncomfortable, but we have to do the work because we impact lives and we're causing more harm than good if we ignore this very real part of our impact. If my presence is triggering, I need to own that and address it and figure out a way to manage it, to have enough self-reflection and empathy to be able to say, if my presence is going to cause more harm, I need to find someone else. That's the work that bioethics has to do. There are a couple things that we need to remember as I close out. We bring ourselves and our biases into the room with us, so we need to own it and address it. People have stressed out when I say this, but it is very important, and I think it is a huge thing in helping to understand how to move forward. It is okay to have a biased or racist thought. It is just not okay for it to be your last thought. It is going to take a lot of time and energy for people to stop having those initial biased and racist thoughts. So that's okay to have. You're not a bad human just because you have it. You've been conditioned that way. You are responsible, though, for that not being your last thought. That's where your work has to be. Figure out ways for not to be your last thought. It's your duty to understand all the additional factors that impact our patients and their outcomes, and then do your part to address it. We have our own powers and spheres of influences, so look at yours. See who's around you. Who do you call your friends? Who are people who come to your home? Who do your kids hang out with? What are their schools? What are their neighborhoods? Heather McGee says a really powerful statement that I really want you all to think through. If you look at the world of segregation in the United States, and we tried to desegregate as much as we could, white people have been the only group that have historically continued to try and force a self-selection or segregation, even though we know that diversification brings so much richness to our lives. So look at your spheres and figure out, have you self-selected some segregation, or are you doing whatever it takes to bring in other diverse voices and minds and ideas and people in order to enrich your own sphere of influence and your power? And then think about that in the places you work and live and the patients that you take care of. Know your own blinders, own them, and improve them. Nobody can do this work for you. I'm not going to give you a Google list of things to read and check out more than the 2 books that I've already highlighted. I'm not going to tell you how to make it happen. I'm not going to give you a training or a program. This is work you have to do on your own. You studied long and hard to get to where you are now and know your own profession. You use that same level of dedication and importance to study this so that you become better as well. So own it and improve it. And like Kayhan said earlier, my favorite quote from Maya Angelou, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. I always like to end my talks with this quote because I feel like by the end of the talk, I'm hoping that I gave you a little bit more to know better. So now I'm expecting you all to do better. So let's just all do better together. Just my references, I have more if you need any. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our questions.
Dr. Sederstrom, that was really, really incredible, powerful presentation. So much to talk about. I wish we had another hour to discuss it, but we only have about 10 minutes. So I invite you all to please submit a question in the Q&A and I'll read it out loud. I will start off with just one initial response. You know, 2 of your slides really just kind of struck a chord with me. The one when you were talking about Medicare and desegregation and how you said that it wasn't a cultural movement that caused these hospitals to desegregate, it was money. And then later you talked about the importance of empathy and how empathy is absolutely essential in building up these trusting relationships. And so maybe it's more of a comment, but I'm glad to see that you are pinpointing the structural issues that exist along with the interpersonal and how I think they both have to work together in order to address these long entrenched problems.
Yes, they do. And I think we don't like looking at our darkness, right? I think that's where the problem is. We don't like facing that darkness, but what I'm learning in my career now as I shift clinical ethics and embed it more in health equity work is that we need to really look long and hard at that darkness. Heather McGee was in town and she talked about how heavy this work was when she was doing the book. And she made a statement that I'm like, I'm going to say for forever, because this is now my new true north. She said she had to fully immerse herself in the darkness before she was able to see the stars shine. And that there are a whole bunch of stars that are doing this work that are trying to shine through, but we ignore them because we don't want to look at the darkness fully. When you do look at the darkness, you realize you're not alone. There are a lot of people wanting to make this better. There are a lot of people trying and begging for ways to improve it. And if we all get the courage to just look at the darkness fully, I think we'll be in a better position, because we'll start to see those stars and become one ourselves, until one day that the stars just outshine the darkness and we've got a beautiful sky. So I'm hopeful that as we build more empathy and as we address the realities that we sit in, the institutions that we're in, I don't know if any of you saw in the news yesterday, Harvard just came out with a announcement that they're spending $100 million to address their role in slavery and how it impacted and built up the university. Also, Georgetown did a similar event of reconciling its role with slavery. These are the kinds of things that are starting the conversations at institutional level. Money is not the thing that needs to be thrown at this, right? I mean, like, there needs to be resources to address it, but we have to own how our everyday actions continue to perpetuate. We have to own how we've just lost the ability to be empathetic to this cause, and then put those things together. And I think we'll have a whole bunch of stars shining.
So I invite folks to ask any questions. It looks like a lot of people are giving you a lot of kudos.
Oh, thank you.
In the chat box, which is always great. Someone mentioned Seattle spending $25 million to end racism. I'm part of the Racism Collaboration. That's Julie Vaughn.
Nice.
So I was wondering also, another comment you made about the issue of racial concordance and how it provides benefits, but it's not an excuse for, say, white clinicians to say, well, I'm not going to engage with Black patients. That,
right.
I was wondering if you could speak to your experience as an ethicist and the issue of racial concordance in the clinical ethics setting, and what do we know about that with regards to engendering, I mean, you kind of alluded to it, but what do we know about that with regards to engendering greater trust, providing more support for patients and families, like you said, are often going through probably the worst period of their lives?
Yeah, so I actually had a really powerful experience with a resident recently who, so I try again to stay away from the bedside, because now I'm doing more of the big strategy stuff, but inevitably I get called in because somebody needs help, right? And this resident was having a hard time because it was a Black patient who was dying. They wanted to withdraw care. They didn't feel like the family was really trusting of what they were trying to do. And they felt that if they could just talk to someone who was Black, that would help, because my institution is very, very white. It's Minnesota, right? It's just the way it is. And I said to this resident, I was like, why do you think that you're not able to take care of this person? And he was like, I don't know. I just think that when they see me, they don't trust me. I represent all the terrible things. And so they're not going to listen. I was like, how about we do this? Like, if I give you some words to say, will you say them? And he was like, yeah, I'll say them. So I said to him, I was like, when we walk, we'll introduce ourselves, just sit down. It's like, the first thing I want you to say to this family is, I realize that I'm white. And I know that my whiteness can be triggering and cause some discomfort. But what I'm going to tell you is that I'm doing everything in my power to see you as a Black family and to treat you the way that I know you need to be treated. I want you to trust that I'm going to have your best interest. And if I fall, if you think that I'm not trusting, or if I'm doing something that makes you feel concerned, tell me, because I'm open to hear it. So he did. We walked in, he said that, and this family visibly just decreased. The daughter started crying. There was this conversation that happened at that time that said, we don't trust white doctors because they've inevitably killed our loved ones, right? So there was this entire history that came out of the conversation. And when this young man said, what I represent when I walk in is something that may be triggering to you, and I'm going to do my best to be better. And if you feel I'm not doing that, I give you permission to let me know. That broke down barriers that he didn't even know were there. He didn't need me, right? I was there because it would have been easier if I talked to them, because they would have easily told me. But he needed to learn how to develop that empathetic point of view, how to understand and own how when he walked in the room, that's what he was bringing. And to know that that's an immediate reaction, it is visceral, it is imprinted in our DNA. It's not something that you actively choose, it's just there. But when you name it and you own it and you open up the space for a conversation, communication happens better. His family got all the answers that they needed. They chose to send their mother home to hospice. It was a great end to a story that was initially going to spiral into the usual non-compliant family. They're this, they're that, you know, like they don't like the system. And now we're going to have to do a non-beneficial policy and withdrawal against their consent, right? There's all kinds of ways that goes down. And all it took was just owning the fact that the differences in their race is impacting their ability to communicate, even without them knowing.
So this other attendee said, in some philosophy literature, empathy has been problematized. Can you really, let me go back there. Can we really step into another person's shoes? Is it projection? Any thoughts on how we can avoid such concerns with racism?
Yeah, so like I just said in this previous example, I don't need you to tell me that you know what it feels like to be a Black woman, right? Like that won't ever work. That won't ever, like that's where it becomes a problem, is if you assume that you can somehow understand my pain, my struggle, and what I go through. What I need for you to do is recognize that there is pain, there is struggle, there are differences between how your life is and mine, and be, instead of an ally, I'm against the ally word. I know people like the ally word. The ally word to me doesn't really sit well, because anybody can be an ally, right? They don't have to like you. They don't have to want your life to be better. They just have to be against the same thing you're against. So that's a very different belief than someone who, in my words, are that I use now as a co-conspirator, right? Someone who goes down with me when things get real. Like I want someone who suffers the same consequences, who puts their life on the line in the same way that I do. That's who I need in this work, not just an ally. I need a co-conspirator. So if you're a legit co-conspirator, then you not only make the space to be in what I need to be in order to be better, but you also know how to use your whiteness in powerful ways to be protective of Black people, and also in ways to be supportive and to be dismantling. So I don't need white people to understand what it means to be Black or have the empathy based off of that. I need them to have a more active, empathetic response that says, how can I use my whiteness, my privilege, my voice in a way that allows for Black people's voices and experiences to be uplifted and to be protected and to be intentionally looked at, because we need to bring intentionality into it. Otherwise, we're never going to get out of this spiral.
So we'll take one last question and then we'll wrap up. So this is from Daya Feltman. She asks, how do we make reparations for the genetic changes trauma has caused? Awful social determinants of health inequities persist that don't help the health of our patients either.
Yeah, the concept of medical reparations. There are a lot of people trying to figure out what to do in this space. It's really difficult because, like I said before, the tolls are immeasurable and they're ongoing, right? Life expectancies are shortened. We just came out of Black Maternal Health Week. We know that Black women have worse maternal health outcomes and infant mortality outcomes. I mean, it's still everyday present. So at what point does one start looking at reparations if we are still trying to figure out how to stop the act of pain, right? I think that we're not there yet. There are some who argue that while we're figuring out the act of pain, we still need to figure out some way of repairing the trauma of the past. And I'd say that the only way that I would agree with that is if the reparations are dedicated to dismantling systems. So if the reparations are things like creating initiatives or using resource structures that actively get at the foundation of the problem, then great. That's where the reparations should go. It shouldn't be like an individual handout. It should be a systemic thing. Build programming that's dedicated to improving health and wellness in Black communities, increase Black and brown clinicians, do ways to address poverty and environmental racism, address climate change issues. Like there's all these things that could be done that are reparations on a big systemic scale. That's more important to affecting the health and wellness of Black people right now and future generations than if we do sort of the age-old 40 acres and a mule promise that there's not there.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I wanted to thank Dr. Sederstrom so much for her presentation today, and for you all for joining us for this first webinar series on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion by ASBH. And this is being recorded, and so I encourage you all to join us for future webinars that'll be scheduled later this year. And once again, thank you so much, Dr. Nneka Sederstrom.
Thank you all. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.